The first thing they told me when I took the night shift at the Coca-Cola bottling plant was simple. Follow the 5 rules, and you might make it to morning. At first, I thought they were joking. A stupid initiation prank for the new guy. But when I looked into my supervisor's face, his hollow, sleep-deprived eyes, the way his hands trembled as he passed me the list, I realized he wasn't laughing. I should have walked out right then. I should have turned around and never stepped foot inside that factory. But I didn't. At first, the job seemed simple. Keep the machines running, check the conveyor belts, and, above all, follow the 5 rules. That was the first thing the supervisor, a hollow-eyed man named Harris, drilled into my head. He didn't explain why, just handed me a wrinkled sheet of paper with 5 short, cryptic instructions. Rule number 1, do not drink from any bottle that comes off the line. Rule number 2, if you hear a voice whisper your name, ignore it. Rule number 3, at exactly 3:15 a.m., step away from all reflective surfaces. Rule number 4, if the syrup room door is open, shut it. Do not look inside. Rule number 5, never, under any circumstance, acknowledge the man in the red uniform. I laughed when I read them. Is this some initiation prank? I asked. Harris didn't laugh. He just shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. By 2 a.m., I realized it wasn't a joke. The machines were relentless, filling, capping, labeling. Endless rows of bottles rattled down the conveyor belts, the liquid inside bubbling like it was alive. The rhythmic clang of machinery filled the plant, a hypnotic, almost maddening sound. I tried to focus, but my skin prickled as if someone was watching me. Every now and then, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, figures shifting in the glass reflections of the bottling machines, shadows lingering in places they shouldn't. Then, the whisper came, soft, almost gentle. My name, Daniel. I froze. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. The whisper wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the glass window of the supervisor's office reflecting my workstation. But the reflection wasn't right. The machines were there, the endless rows of bottles, but my reflection was missing. Instead, something else stood in my place. A figure, tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It had no eyes, just deep, hollow sockets that seemed to stretch forever. Its mouth was open, but no sound came out. I watched in frozen horror as its lips moved, whispering my name again. The paper in my pocket crinkled as I clenched my fist. Rule number 2, if you hear a voice whisper your name, ignore it. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my breath to slow. The whisper came again, closer. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my brain repeated the rule like a desperate prayer. Ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. After what felt like hours, the whispering stopped. I cracked my eyes open. The reflection had returned to normal. The factory was still, except for the machines, clanking away as if nothing had happened. I forced my trembling hands to keep working. The minutes dragged on. Every noise felt too sharp, too deliberate. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Lack of sleep, stress, maybe some chemical fumes in the air. But deep down I knew. This place wasn't normal. Then the clock struck 3:15 a.m. A sharp hiss echoed through the plant, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. A chill wrapped around me like a noose. My stomach dropped as I realized I was standing in front of the giant metal mixing vat. Its surface, polished steel, reflected the factory floor behind me. Rule number 3. At exactly 3:15 a.m., step away from all reflective surfaces. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a crate of empty bottles. As I moved, the reflection in the vat twisted. The factory around me was distorted, stretched like melted wax. But it wasn't the machines or the bottles that made my blood turn to ice. It was the people, or what used to be people. Figures in old Coca-Cola uniforms, their faces gaunt and hollow. Some had missing eyes, others gaping holes where their mouths should have been. Their hands twitched, reaching out, their fingers stretching far too long. And then they turned to look at me. I bolted. I ran blindly, my boots slamming against the concrete floor. The factory was a maze of machinery and conveyor belts, the red emergency lights casting grotesque shadows along the walls. Behind me, I heard the screech of metal, the whispering voices growing louder. I didn't stop until I reached the syrup room. The massive door stood slightly ajar, the darkness inside yawning like an open mouth. Rule number 4. If the syrup room door is open, shut it. Do not look inside. A wet, slithering noise came from the room. The air reeked of something foul, something rotting beneath the sickly sweetness of syrup. My hands shook as I reached for the door. The darkness inside felt alive, pressing against the threshold like it wanted to spill out. I gritted my teeth and slammed the door shut. The sound stopped. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, the shadows no longer moved, but the air in the factory remained heavy, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Then, a soft shuffle of footsteps echoed behind me, slow, deliberate. A figure stepped into my peripheral vision, a man in a crisp COCA-COLA uniform, the deep red fabric eerily pristine. His face was blank, featureless, as if someone had wiped it clean. The final rule echoed in my head. Never, under any circumstance, acknowledge the man in the red uniform. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs might crack. The man stood just inches away, unmoving, silent. I could feel his presence, colder than the factory air, heavier than the shadows. I clenched my jaw, staring straight ahead. Don't look, don't react. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the factory lights flickered, and he was gone. But the feeling he left behind still clung to me, a crawling sensation down my spine, like invisible fingers brushing against my skin. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the rules existed for a reason. Someone, many someones, had seen what I was seeing now, had heard the whispers, had felt the unseen eyes. Some of them hadn't made it out. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the far end of the factory, cutting through the mechanical drone like a gunshot. My head snapped toward the sound, my stomach twisting. One of the syrup drums had tipped over, rolling slightly before coming to a stop. Thick black syrup oozed from its seams, pooling across the concrete floor like fresh blood. But there was something else mixed in the sticky mess. Something pale, small, a fingertip. My breath hitched. My throat went dry. The syrup wasn't just syrup. My body screamed at me to move, to get away, but my legs were locked in place. The syrup continued to spread, the glistening surface reflecting the overhead lights in a way that made my stomach churn. I thought I saw something shift within it, something pale twisting just beneath the surface, but I refused to look closer. A rustling sound came from behind me, not the shuffle of footsteps, not the hum of the machines. It was wet, organic. I turned my head ever so slightly. The syrup drum wasn't empty. Something inside it was moving. I took a slow step back, then another. The factory floor stretched out before me, too open, too exposed. The emergency exit was on the far side of the building, past rows of towering machinery, darkened hallways, and, most importantly, the syrup room. The same syrup room I had locked shut only minutes ago. The door was open, wide open, and something stood inside the darkness. It wasn't a person. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and thin, barely visible against the shadows. But I could see its eyes, not glowing, not reflecting light like an animal's. Just there, watching me. I didn't hear footsteps, I didn't hear breathing. But I knew, in the pit of my stomach, that it was aware of me. A deep, guttural creak filled the air, the sound of the syrup drum shifting. The thick ooze continued to spread, the syrup rippling unnaturally as if something was rising beneath it. I ran. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I bolted across the factory floor, weaving between machinery, my boots skidding against the syrup-coated concrete. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my vision tunneling as I focused on one thing, the door to the break room. It wasn't an exit, but it was the only place I could go. The moment I burst inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The room was small, cramped with old metal lockers, a few chairs, and a vending machine humming softly in the corner. Fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting everything in a sickly yellow hue. My pulse pounded in my ears. I pressed my back against the door, half expecting something to slam into it from the other side. Nothing. Silence. Except, not quite. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound filled the room, soft, inconsistent, like fingertips drumming against metal. I turned my head slowly. One of the lockers was moving, not violently, just trembling. A slow, subtle shake, as if something was shifting inside. My gut twisted into knots. I took a cautious step forward, my breath shallow. The metal door rattled slightly, the tapping growing louder. Closer. I reached a shaking hand toward the handle. The vending machine behind me let out a loud clunk. I spun around, my heart lurching into my throat. A bottle of Coca-Cola had fallen into the tray below, but I hadn't put any money in. and the machine was unplugged. A low whisper slithered through the room. My name. Drawn out, stretched thin. I backed away, my body screaming at me to leave, to run, but before I could reach the door, the locker burst open. A body tumbled out. It hit the floor with a sickening thud, limbs bent at unnatural angles, bones sticking out where they shouldn't. The uniform was the same as mine, stained dark with something too thick to be blood. The head lolled to the side, and I saw its face. My face. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless flesh stretched too tight over the skull. My stomach lurched. My mind screamed at me that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. A hand shot out, latching onto my ankle. Cold. Wrong. Its grip was impossibly strong, the fingers digging into my skin, pulling, dragging. I let out a strangled yell, kicking, thrashing. The thing on the floor convulsed, twitching violently, its empty face tilting up toward me. The vending machine let out another loud clunk. Another bottle dropping. The whispers grew louder. More voices, more names. I ripped myself free and bolted out the door. The factory was wrong. The layout had changed. The machines loomed taller, the aisles stretching impossibly long. The red glow of the Coca-Cola logo outside filtered in through the high windows, casting deep shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking. The air buzzed with static, like a radio stuck between stations. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the distinct sound of polished boots against concrete. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The man in the red uniform. Rule number 5. Never, under any circumstance, acknowledge him. I forced myself to keep walking, to ignore the creeping dread curling around my ribs, but the footsteps followed, keeping pace with me. Then they stopped. A breath of cold air ghosted across my neck. He was right behind me. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. The urge to turn, to see him, was unbearable. The factory seemed to hold its breath, the machines slowing, the sounds warping into something distant and hollow. Then a voice, low, soft, not a whisper, not my name, just a simple question. Thirsty? The word slithered through the air, curling around me like invisible fingers. It wasn't a question, it was an invitation, a trap. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. The factory stretched around me, warped and unnatural, the red glow from the Coca-Cola logo outside pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The machines groaned, their steady hum distorted, the clank of metal on metal dragging into long, unnatural echoes. The air was thick, cloying with the syrupy scent of cola, but beneath it, something rancid lurked, something sweet but wrong. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but I knew he was still there. The man in the red uniform. Rule number 5. Never, under any circumstance, acknowledge him. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to run, to bolt down the endless aisles of machinery, but my legs refused to move. My body felt heavy, my limbs sluggish, as if something unseen had wrapped around me, sinking deep into my bones. The voice came again, softer this time. Go on, just one sip. A cold, wet pressure brushed against my hand. My fingers twitched involuntarily, and I felt it. A glass bottle, ice cold, dripping with condensation. The cap was already off. I didn't grab it. I wouldn't grab it. I knew, somehow, deep in the marrow of my bones, that if I drank, I wouldn't be me anymore. The factory groaned, the sound vibrating through the floor beneath me. My breathing came in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering in my skull. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. Right there. Close enough that if I turned, I would see the crisp red uniform. The polished black boots, the smile that wasn't really a smile at all. A single drop of liquid rolled down the side of the bottle, landing against my skin. It burned. I jerked my hand away, the motion snapping me free from whatever unseen force had held me in place. Without thinking, I bolted, my footsteps echoing wildly against the concrete floor. The machines loomed over me, impossibly tall, their metal surfaces slick with condensation. The factory floor was shifting again, stretching, twisting, the aisles stretching into infinity. My breath came in short gasps, panic clawing at my throat. The red glow from the windows seemed to bleed into everything, tainting the air itself. Then, ahead of me, the syrup room. The door was still open, still wrong. I had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. I plunged inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. Thick, heavy, like stepping into a room filled with steam, but cold. I could taste the syrup in the air, thick and cloying, coating the inside of my throat. The smell of overripe fruit had intensified, but now it was mixed with something else. Something bitter. The vats loomed high above me, massive metal structures filled with liquid that should have been dark brown but wasn't. It was thicker, more viscous, and when the overhead lights flickered, I swore I saw something moving inside. I stepped forward, my boots sticking slightly to the floor. The syrup had spread, a thin, glistening layer coating everything. And then I heard it, a wet drip. I looked up. The ceiling was wrong. Shadows pooled in the corners, twisting unnaturally, shifting like something alive. And hanging from the pipes, suspended by thick strands of something syrupy and dark, bodies. Half-formed, some with no skin, others with no eyes, their mouths frozen open in silent screams. Their limbs hung limply, syrup oozing from gaping wounds, dripping onto the floor below. And then one of them moved. A slow, sickening twitch of the fingers. A low, wet gurgle bubbled from its throat. My stomach lurched, my vision swimming. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the syrup-coated floor. My breath hitched. The air was growing thicker, harder to inhale, the scent of decaying fruit overpowering. Then I heard something worse, a sloshing sound, from inside the vats. I turned my head slowly, my body screaming at me not to look. Something was rising from the liquid. The surface of the syrup bulged outward, trembling, stretching until it split. A hand emerged, long fingers, too many joints, the skin swollen and translucent, veins pulsing beneath the surface. It reached upward, grasping at the air, before another hand followed. Then a head. The face wasn't human. It almost was, but something was wrong. The features were too smooth, the eyes too round, too full of something that wasn't life. Its mouth opened, and thick syrup poured out, splattering against the factory floor. The sound it made wasn't a voice. It was a gurgle, wet and sickly, like something drowning. I took a step back. It turned its head toward me. I ran. My boots skidded across the syrup-coated floor as I tore out of the syrup room, my breath ragged, my pulse thundering in my ears. The factory was shifting again, the aisles twisting, the machines groaning like they were alive. I didn't know where I was running. I just knew I had to get away. But then, a hand closed around my wrist, cold, strong. I twisted, expecting to see the thing from the syrup vat. But it wasn't. It was the supervisor. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. His grip was impossibly tight, his fingers digging into my arm. "What did you do?" he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. His grip tightened. "You weren't supposed to go in there." Behind him, the factory continued to shift, the red glow deepening, pulsing like something breathing. The machines groaned, metal twisting. I swore I could hear voices in the hum of the conveyor belts. The supervisor's grip on my wrist was like iron. "You need to listen," he whispered, his breath cold against my skin. "You need to follow the rules." A sharp sound rang out. The factory's intercom crackled to life. A voice, hollow, distant. It spoke only 3 words. "Break time's over." The intercom crackled with those 3 hollow words. The voice was wrong, stretched, empty, yet filled with something I couldn't comprehend. The factory seemed to shudder around me, as if the very walls had heard and obeyed. The supervisor's grip on my wrist was ice cold, tightening like a vice. His pupils were dilated, swallowing the color of his irises, making his eyes look hollow. His breath came in sharp, ragged exhales, his skin slick with an unnatural sweat. "You shouldn't have seen that," he whispered. I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the humid, syrup-thick air. The intercom clicked off, but something lingered in the silence. A presence, heavy and watching. The supervisor didn't let go. Instead, his fingers twitched, as if his body was deciding between dragging me somewhere or letting me go. His lips barely moved as he murmured, "Keep working. Act normal." Normal? I turned my head slightly. The factory floor had changed again. The conveyor belts still churned, bottles of Coca-Cola rattling along their tracks. But the workers... something was wrong with them. Their movements were stiff, robotic, out of sync with the usual rhythm. They lifted bottles, twisted caps, stacked crates, but their heads never moved, their eyes never blinked. Their mouths hung slightly open, lips trembling, as though whispering something beneath the sound of the machinery. And then, one of them twitched, a violent, unnatural jerk of the neck, the sound of bones shifting and crunching deep within their spine. Their fingers convulsed around the bottle they were holding, shattering it. Dark liquid spilled across the floor, fizzing, but the worker didn't react. Neither did the others. Not a single one of them turned to look. My stomach twisted. "Go," the supervisor urged. "Work." I took a slow step forward, and he finally released my wrist. My skin tingled where his fingers had pressed, as if something unseen had seeped into my bloodstream. I moved to the nearest conveyor belt, my fingers shaking as I reached for a glass bottle. It was ice cold, slick with condensation. The familiar weight was comforting, but the moment I held it, I noticed something. The liquid inside wasn't the normal dark brown, it was thicker, darker. Something moved within it, a slow, twisting motion, like ink unfurling through water. I set it down immediately. The worker next to me didn't react, but I could feel them watching. Not with their eyes, those remained frozen, unfocused, but with something deeper. The air around them felt wrong. The intercom buzzed again, a single sound, a low, distorted hum, like a deep exhale dragging across a microphone. Then, a thud from behind me. I turned slowly. One of the workers had collapsed. Their body twitched violently, limbs flailing against the cold concrete. Their mouth hung open, dark foam bubbling at their lips. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, glassy. No one reacted. Not a single worker turned their head. The machines kept running. The conveyor belts kept churning. The factory floor continued its endless, automated rhythm. But then the body twitched, hard. The sound that came from their throat wasn't human, a wet, gargled choke, as though something was writhing inside them, trying to force its way out. The supervisor's voice was in my ear again, so low I barely heard it. "Don't help. Keep working." My breath came in shallow gasps, my fingers locking around another glass bottle just to ground myself. The body twitched again. This time something split. A thin, glistening crack along their neck. Syrupy liquid oozed out, dark, almost black, thick as tar. The factory lights flickered, bathing the scene in sporadic flashes of red. The worker's mouth stretched open wider than it should have. A hand reached out from inside. I staggered back, my stomach lurching. It wasn't a normal hand. It was glossy, wet, the fingers stretched and unnatural, the skin almost translucent. It gripped the edge of the worker's jaw, using it to pull itself free. The body convulsed violently as the thing inside crawled out. My legs locked in place. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but the supervisor's whisper was in my ear again. "Keep working." My shaking hands moved on instinct, reaching for another bottle, going through the motions. My pulse thundered in my skull, but I forced myself to pretend, to act normal. Behind me, the thing slithered out of its human shell, its wet limbs slapping against the floor. A new worker stepped up to the conveyor belt. Same uniform, same empty stare. My head spun. No one reacted. No one cared. I turned back to my station, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. The intercom crackled again, a voice hollow and cold. No wasting product. I chanced another glance at the shattered bottle on the floor. The dark liquid inside was still moving. I forced myself to keep working, my breath unsteady, my fingers trembling as I twisted caps and stacked crates. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time had no meaning here. The air grew heavier, the factory's hum sinking into my bones, threading itself through my veins. The workers beside me moved in perfect unison, their glassy eyes staring straight ahead. Then, another thud, another body hitting the floor, another worker convulsing, their mouth stretching impossibly wide. The process began again. I couldn't take it. I turned, locking eyes with the supervisor. His face was paler than before, his pupils blown wide. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "You need to get out." The intercom crackled, louder this time. "Do not abandon your station." The factory floor shook, the walls groaned, the machines screamed, and then the lights went out. The darkness swallowed everything. A thick, suffocating void, pressing down on my chest, filling my lungs with something heavier than air. The machines had stopped. The conveyor belts were silent. But the factory wasn't empty. Something moved in the pitch black. A wet, slithering sound. Slow, deliberate. I wasn't alone. I held my breath, straining to hear past the ringing in my ears. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. Too loud, too obvious. I could feel it. Something was near. Close enough to touch. A sharp inhale, not mine. Something was breathing beside me. The darkness wasn't just empty air. It was full of something. It coiled around me, thick and pulsing, like it was alive. And then, a voice, low, guttural, right against my ear. "Why did you stop working?" A hand grabbed my wrist. Cold, slimy. The grip was impossibly strong, the fingers digging into my skin like they wanted to fuse with it. I jerked back, but the thing held on. I couldn't see it. I didn't want to see it. My breath hitched, my throat locking up. My free hands scrambled in the darkness, searching for anything, something to anchor myself, something to fight with. My fingers brushed against cold glass. A bottle. The grip on my wrist tightened. I swung the bottle blindly. Glass shattered. A wet, sickening gurgle filled the air. The thing screeched, a high-pitched, garbled sound that made my skull vibrate. The grip loosened. I didn't wait. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor, my hands outstretched, groping through the thick blackness. The factory wasn't big. There had to be a way out. A door, a stairwell, something. A flash of red light, blinking, flickering. The emergency exit sign. I ran toward it, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, shifting, alive, watching. Something brushed against my shoulder, long fingers, slick with something warm. I swung again but hit nothing. The emergency exit was just ahead. A few more steps, the red light flickered, and then it vanished, snuffed out like it had never been there. The darkness closed in, thicker than before. I felt something shift, felt the temperature drop, a sound, a wet, dragging noise. I turned, chest heaving. The workers were standing there, dozens of them, motionless, silent. Their faces were wrong, stretched too tight, lips curled into unnatural grins. Their glassy eyes reflected nothing, no emotion, no thought, just empty. And then one of them stepped forward. The sound wasn't human. Their foot hit the floor with a wet slap. Something poured out of their pant leg, a dark, viscous liquid spreading across the concrete. The scent of syrup and rust filled my nose. Another worker moved. Their joints popped unnaturally, like bones shifting out of place. I took a step back. They all took a step forward, a synchronized, unnatural march. The intercom crackled. A voice, deeper than before, distorted beyond recognition. No leaving the factory. The walls shuddered. The ground beneath me shifted. The factory itself was alive. I turned to run, but the workers moved faster than they should have. Their hands reached for me, fingers too long, nails black and peeling. Their mouths opened, revealing rows of something wet and moving inside. I screamed and lunged for the nearest machine. My fingers found a switch, cold metal, slick with sweat. I flipped it. The conveyor belts jolted to life. The workers hesitated. For the first time, their movements weren't synchronized. One of them twitched, their neck jerking at an impossible angle. Another staggered back, their lips trembling, as though trying to speak. I didn't stop. I grabbed another switch, pulled another lever. The machines roared. The bottling equipment screamed to life, pistons hissing, steam rising. The room was filled with the deafening clatter of glass bottles slamming together. The workers twitched violently. One of them collapsed. The thick, dark liquid poured out of their ears, their nose, their mouth. The air smelled wrong. I backed away, heart racing. The factory floor trembled beneath me. Something deep within the building groaned. The intercom screeched, "Do not damage the product." The sound was unbearable, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I clapped my hands over my ears, my skull vibrating with the force of it. And then, the factory went still. The machines stopped. The workers stood motionless. The intercom buzzed softly, a single cold whisper. "You broke the rules." The emergency lights flickered back on. Dim red light bathed the factory in a sickly glow. The workers had stopped moving, but they hadn't stopped watching. A hand gripped my shoulder. I turned. The supervisor. His skin was paler than before, his veins black beneath the surface. His pupils were gone, swallowed by endless darkness. His lips barely moved as he spoke. "Run!" I didn't hesitate. I bolted toward the factory doors, my breath ragged, my body screaming for escape. Behind me, the workers moved, faster than before. Their limbs jerked violently, their heads twisting unnaturally, their mouths stretching wider, wider, wider. The intercom buzzed again. "You cannot leave." I reached the door. I grabbed the handle. It melted beneath my touch. The factory walls shifted. The workers were closing in. The lights flickered. The ground beneath me cracked. And then, the floor gave way. I was falling. The air rushed past me, thick and suffocating, as if the very factory was swallowing me whole. My stomach lurched, my limbs flailing for something, anything to grab onto. But there was nothing. Only the void below, a gaping maw in the earth that stretched endlessly downward. The dim emergency lights above flickered and shrank until they were nothing more than distant, bleeding pinpricks. Then, impact. The landing wasn't as violent as I expected. It was worse. I didn't hit solid ground. I sank, thick, sticky. I gasped, my hands clawing through the gelatinous substance that clung to my skin, wrapping around my fingers like living tar. It was warm, too warm, and the smell hit me instantly. Syrup. The factory's syrup. Only it wasn't just that. It was darker, thicker, the consistency of congealed blood. I thrashed, trying to pull myself free, but it clung to me, pulling me deeper. My legs were useless, my body sinking inch by inch, the thick liquid slithering up my chest, my neck. I opened my mouth to scream, but the second I did, it poured in. Sweet, rotten wrong. I gagged, choked, my throat burning as the thick substance forced its way down. It tasted like syrup and something else, something alive. My lungs screamed for air, my vision blurred, my body jerking violently against the pull. Then, hands, grabbing me, dozens of them, slick and cold, bursting out of the syrup, clawing at my arms, my shoulders, at my face. The grip was inhuman, too strong, fingers digging into my flesh, pulling, tearing. I barely had time to process what was happening before I was yanked down. The syrup wasn't just a pit, it was an entrance. I plunged beneath the surface, the world around me swallowing into an abyss. Darkness. The pressure crushed my chest, my heartbeat a frantic hammer against my ribs. The syrup, no, the thing, seeped into my pores, slipping beneath my skin, worming through my veins. I could feel it moving inside me, filling me, changing me. Shapes moved in the darkness. I wasn't alone. Silhouettes writhed in the thick void around me, their bodies distorted, their mouths stretched in eternal, silent screams. Eyes, so many eyes glowed dimly in the blackness, watching, waiting. Then, whispers. Not from above, from inside me. A voice, no, voices, writhing through my mind, their words sticky and sweet. You are part of us now. A shrill, suffocating terror erupted inside me, and I fought. I didn't know how, but I fought. I forced my arms to move, clawing through the suffocating liquid, desperate to rise. The hands gripped tighter, nails sinking into my flesh, but I didn't stop. My body was screaming, my lungs burning, my vision dimming, and then I broke through. I gasped, syrup pouring from my mouth as I heaved in ragged gulps of air. My body trembled violently, the sticky substance still clinging to my skin, crawling over me, resisting my escape. I wasn't in the same place anymore. I had emerged into something else, a room, but not a normal one. The walls pulsed, throbbing like they were alive. Tubes ran along the ceiling, thick and transparent, carrying the same dark syrup through them like veins pumping blood. The floor beneath me was soft, almost flesh-like. The worst part? The bottles. Hundreds, thousands of Coca-Cola bottles stacked in neat rows. But the liquid inside wasn't normal. It was thick, dark, moving. And floating inside each bottle, eyes, blinking, watching. I staggered back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my body was frozen. A hiss, the walls shuddered, and then movement. A shape peeled itself from the farthest wall. No, not a shape, a person, or what used to be one. The skin was translucent, veins blackened and pulsing. Its arms were too long, its fingers stretched into twitching, unnatural points. Its eyes, empty holes, dripping with syrup. It opened its mouth, and the voice that came out, "You are the new product." I ran. I sprinted, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. The thing moved after me, fast, too fast, its elongated limbs jerking as it slithered forward. The room stretched endlessly, bottles rattling, the walls breathing. I couldn't find a door, couldn't find a way out. Then, a noise. A loud mechanical grind. Ahead of me, a metal hatch slid open. An exit. I didn't care where it led. I dove through, my body hitting cold steel as I tumbled inside. The hatch slammed shut behind me. Silence. Then, dripping, I turned. I was in another factory room, but this one wasn't like the others. This one was worse. The machines were still running. Conveyor belts rattled, gears churned, steam hissed from unseen vents, and on the assembly line, bodies. Not bottles, bodies. They moved along the belts, limp and lifeless, their skin glistening with a thick syrupy sheen. Tubes were embedded in their arms, their legs, their mouths, siphoning the dark liquid into massive vats. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The workers, what was left of them, were hanging from the ceiling, their bodies suspended by thick, pulsing tubes that fed into the machines. Their faces were contorted, locked in expressions of silent agony. The realization hit me like a hammer. This was where the product was made, not just the syrup, the workers themselves. The Coca-Cola bottling plant didn't just produce soda, it created something else entirely. The intercom buzzed, the voice returned, cold, amused. You shouldn't have seen this. The conveyor belt sped up, the hanging bodies twitched, and then they opened their eyes. Not gradually, not with a sluggish blink, but all at once, snapping wide with a sickening wet pop. Hundreds of them. Bodies dangling from the ceiling, veins stretched taut, their pupils like inky black holes drinking in the dim, flickering light. The tubes buried in their flesh pulsed, sucking, pumping, their hollowed-out faces twitching, as if rediscovering the concept of movement. Then they started screaming. Not human screams. Not the kind you'd hear from someone in pain or terror. These were layered, distorted, overlapping shrieks that rattled my skull, digging into my brain like jagged teeth. The sound was a summoning, a call that echoed through the walls, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. And something answered. From the far end of the factory, deep within the tangled maze of rusted pipes and hissing machinery, something shifted. A wet, dragging noise, like flesh being peeled from metal. A groan, deep and ancient, vibrating through the very air. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. The conveyor belts lurched into motion, grinding and clanking as the limp bodies began to move. Some of them twitched, spasming violently, their mouths stretching wider than humanly possible, syrup bubbling from their throats. Arms jerked, muscles twitching, fingers curling into desperate claws. They weren't dead. They were waking up. I weaved through the machinery, ducking under swinging metal arms, dodging the thick tubes that snaked along the walls like veins. The factory was shifting, changing, the floor tilting beneath me as if it were a living thing. A sharp clang erupted from behind me. I turned. One of the suspended bodies had ripped itself free. It hit the ground in a heap of tangled limbs, syrup pouring from its mouth and eye sockets. For a second, it didn't move, just lay there, twitching. Then, with a sickening snap, it twisted its neck toward me. The face was unrecognizable, skin stretched too tight, eyes sunk in pits of darkness, mouth stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. And then, it stood up. Not naturally. It jerked upright, its limbs moving with a violent, unnatural stiffness, as if it were being puppeteered by something unseen. And it wasn't alone. All around me, the others were ripping free. The tubes that had been keeping them in place fought back, writhing and coiling around them, as if trying to pull them back into place. But the things were stronger. They tore through their restraints, syrup sloshing onto the floor as their bodies cracked and twisted unnaturally, adjusting to their newfound freedom. And then, they ran at me. I turned and bolted, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs would snap. My boots pounded against the slick floor, slipping on the sticky syrup pooling beneath the machinery. The creatures moved fast, their bodies convulsing and twitching with every step, their bones cracking as they moved in erratic, nightmarish jerks. I dodged between the machines, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick with the scent of burnt sugar and something rotting. The conveyor belts whirred and clanked, spitting out bottles filled with that same dark syrup, the liquid inside churning like it was alive. A scream erupted just behind me, too close. I turned a corner, only to skid to a halt as a massive industrial mixer loomed in front of me, its spinning blades whirling at impossible speeds. Trapped. The things were gaining, their shrieks bouncing off the metal walls. My mind was a whirlwind of panic, searching, desperate for an escape. My eyes darted up, a ventilation shaft. It was small, barely large enough to squeeze through, but I had no other choice. I leapt, grabbing the grated edge, my fingers slipping against the syrup-slick metal. I pulled myself up, muscles screaming in protest, my body fighting against exhaustion. Just as I hoisted myself inside, something grabbed my ankle. A freezing, claw-like grip, fingers digging deep, nails splitting my skin. I kicked violently, pain exploding through my leg as I made contact with something soft. A crack. The grip loosened, and I scrambled forward, my body shaking. I didn't stop to look back. I just crawled, the metal shaft groaning under my weight. The factory below me was chaos. Machines sparked and hissed, the conveyor belts jamming as more bodies spilled onto the floor, writhing and twisting. The intercom crackled, spewing out a distorted voice, the words garbled but mocking. "You are almost ready." I clenched my teeth, forcing my body forward. The heat inside the vents was unbearable, my lungs screaming for fresh air. Then, ahead of me, I saw it, light, a way out. I sped up, ignoring the burning pain in my limbs, the sweat dripping into my eyes. The vent opened into another corridor, a different part of the factory, But this one was quiet, too quiet. I dropped down, landing hard on my feet. My breath came in sharp gasps as I surveyed my surroundings. This hallway was different, cleaner. The walls were smooth metal, no exposed pipes, no rusted grates. The air was cold, sterile. I turned, and my stomach dropped. Glass walls, rows of them, and inside, people. They were standing upright, motionless, their faces blank. Hundreds of them. Their eyes open but empty, their bodies encased in thick glass tubes filled with the same dark syrup. Each one connected to a web of wires and tubes, the liquid swirling around them, inside them. A chill ran down my spine. They weren't just bodies. They were being stored, prepared, processed. I took a step back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The realization settled over me like ice. This wasn't just a factory. It was a harvest, and I was next. The intercom buzzed. The voice was clearer now. No static, no distortion, just one sentence. Welcome to the final stage. The intercom clicked off, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The words still echoed in my mind. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my body frozen between fight and flight. The glass tubes stretched endlessly before me, each containing a person suspended in that sickly dark syrup, their faces disturbingly blank. The liquid pulsed as if alive, curling around their bodies in slow, lazy spirals. Then, one of them moved. A slow, shuddering twitch of the fingers, barely noticeable, but enough to send a cold rush of dread through my veins. Then another twitched, and another. A chorus of faint, rhythmic taps filled the corridor, their fingernails rapping against the glass in perfect synchronization. My pulse thundered in my ears as I took a trembling step backward, my eyes darting from one tube to the next. The tapping grew louder, faster, and then cracks formed. Hairline fractures snaked across the glass, splintering like delicate spiderwebs. The fluid inside churned violently, bubbles forming and bursting as if something within was waking up. My breath hitched as one of the figures snapped its head toward me, its empty eyes locking onto mine through the webbed glass. The silence shattered. The tubes exploded in unison, shards of glass flying like shrapnel. The liquid gushed onto the floor, thick and syrupy, spreading in a slow-moving flood. Bodies crumpled forward, landing with wet, boneless thuds. For a moment, they lay motionless in the spreading darkness. Then they began to rise. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Their eyes were empty sockets, dark and glistening, their mouths gaping as if silently screaming. They swayed in unison, dripping with the thick pulsing syrup that now coated the floor. And then they crawled toward me. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the viscous liquid. My stomach clenched as I saw their hands, elongated fingers that had stretched unnaturally, their nails sharp and curling inward like hooked claws. The syrup clung to them, thick strands of it stretching from their bodies as they dragged themselves closer, their movements gaining speed. I turned and ran. The corridor twisted and turned, the sterile metal walls reflecting my panicked movements. I could hear them behind me, their wet limbs slapping against the floor, the sticky sound sending shivers down my spine. The intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't words. It was laughter, distorted, hollow, echoing through the halls as if the factory itself was amused by my struggle. The walls groaned, metal warping and shifting, the passageways closing in around me. I reached a heavy steel door and slammed my shoulder into it. It didn't budge. The laughter over the intercom rose in pitch, blending with the sickening squelches of the things crawling toward me. Desperation clawed at my throat as I fumbled for anything to pry it open. Then I saw it. A keypad. The factory had security measures. A code. There had to be a code. The creatures were almost upon me. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to think. The laughter still rang through the speakers, but beneath it, something else. A voice. A whisper. It was reciting numbers. A countdown. I punched them in without hesitating, my fingers shaking. The keypad beeped once, and with a hiss of pressurized air, the door slid open just as a cold, slimy hand grazed my ankle. I dove through, slamming the door shut behind me. The thing shrieked, the sound muffled by the thick steel. I collapsed against the door, chest heaving, my entire body trembling. The room I had entered was dimly lit, the only source of illumination a set of flickering overhead bulbs. And in the center, a vat, massive, industrial. A deep, swirling pool of the black syrup, its surface shifting as if something moved beneath it. Pipes snaked out from the vat, leading to machines that hummed and vibrated, their gauges flickering erratically. The air was thick with the scent of burnt sugar, so strong it made my eyes water. The intercom crackled again. "Do you understand now?" The voice was closer this time. Not a recording. Something was here. A shape moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim light. A silhouette, tall, elongated, impossibly thin. My breath hitched as it stepped forward, its face obscured by the flickering darkness. "You were never meant to leave." The syrup in the vat rippled, the pipes hissed, and then from the inky depths, something rose. A figure. No, figures. Twisting together, merging, separating, their limbs stretching and intertwining, their faces melding into one another in a nightmarish tangle of flesh. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes nothing but black voids. I staggered back, my mind struggling to comprehend the horror unfolding before me. The intercom voice chuckled. "You see, we don't just bottle beverages here." The figures convulsed, their bodies warping, shifting, reshaping. "We bottle something else." The syrup surged upward, tendrils of it lashing out, reaching for me. I turned and ran, again. The pipes above me groaned as I sprinted through the darkened corridor, the walls trembling as if something enormous was shifting within them. Behind me, the syrup surged forward like a living tide, its tendrils stretching, grasping, hunting. The distorted laughter still echoed from the intercom, but now it sounded less like amusement and more like something hungry. My boots slapped against the metal grates, my lungs burning as I pushed myself forward. The factory was alive. It had been alive all along. The air thickened, turning sticky with the sickly sweet scent of syrup, and my stomach churned at the sensation of it clinging to my skin. I could hear it slithering behind me, moving in unnatural, jerking bursts, the things within it whispering in voices that weren't human. I turned a corner, nearly losing my footing as I stumbled into another corridor lined with more vats. Massive industrial tanks filled with the same black liquid, their glass windows revealing shifting silhouettes pressing against the inside. Then, they moved. Bodies slammed against the glass from within the vats, their limbs distorted, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The liquid pulsed violently, bubbling as if something inside was desperate to escape. A high-pitched whine filled the air as pressure built, the metal around me creaking, groaning, splitting. The vats burst. Syrup exploded outward in thick waves, flooding the floor in an instant. The figures collapsed forward, spilling onto the metal grating like lifeless mannequins, until they twitched. I didn't wait. I ran. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, stretching shadows across the walls. The factory was shifting, reshaping itself. Doors that had been open before were now sealed shut. Hallways that had been empty were now choked with writhing, syrup-drenched bodies crawling toward me, their fingers clawing at the grates as they moved in perfect, inhuman unison. The intercom crackled. Almost time. The voice was closer now. A doorway loomed ahead, larger than the others, marked with a symbol I hadn't seen before. My instincts screamed at me to go through it. I reached for the handle just as the air around me grew impossibly heavy, the syrup behind me surging forward with a screeching wail. I threw myself through the doorway, slamming it shut, just as the wave of liquid crashed against it. Silence. The only sound was my ragged breathing. I turned, my body trembling, my hands slick with sweat. The room I had entered was unlike the others, larger, colder, the walls lined with complex machinery that hummed softly in the dim light. And in the center of it all, a bottling line. But instead of the usual Coca-Cola bottles, these were filled with the thick black syrup. I took a shaky step closer, my eyes locked on the conveyor belt as the bottles moved, each one sealed and labeled. My stomach twisted as I saw what was inside. Faces, distorted, twisted, frozen in silent, eternal screams. The intercom buzzed. "We told you not to break the rules." The room lurched. The pipes above hissed, releasing bursts of scalding steam. The machines groaned, gears grinding, the entire assembly line shaking as if something massive was stirring beneath it. And then, the syrup began to rise, not from the floor, from the bottles. The faces within twisted, their mouths stretching wider, their hollow eyes watching me. The glass trembled, tiny fractures forming along the surface. The intercom crackled one last time. It's too late now. The first bottle burst, then the next, and then all of them. The sound of shattering glass was deafening. 1,000 bottles burst open in unison, and from their fractured remains, the black syrup spilled out. But it didn't just spread across the floor. It moved. It writhed, twisting together into grotesque shapes, forming something not human, but wearing the remnants of what once had been. The faces inside the bottles were no longer trapped behind glass. They rose from the liquid, their mouths stretched open in silent, anguished screams. Their hollow, syrup-filled eyes locked onto me, and I knew they saw me. The factory shook. The pipes above me trembled, leaking viscous drips of darkness that joined the writhing mass below. The machines groaned, gears twisting unnaturally, their movements no longer mechanical but alive. The conveyor belt snapped, whipping through the air like a serpent. The intercom crackled one final time, but this time there were no words, just breathing. Heavy. Right behind me. I turned, the doorway was gone. No walls, no exits, only darkness stretching infinitely beyond the shattered remains of the bottling line. The air itself seemed to pulse, a deep rhythmic thrum, like the heartbeat of something massive just beneath the surface. Then it rose. A shape unfolded from the shadows, tall and jagged, its form shifting like something that couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Its body was made of the syrup, swirling and pulsing, its limbs stretching too far, bending in directions that defied nature. It had no face, only the vague impression of one, shifting and changing as if stolen from the bottled souls now seeping into the floor. But its mouth was real. It opened, stretching wide, revealing rows of teeth that weren't made for consuming. They were made for breaking, for grinding, for crushing. I stumbled back, my hands colliding with the shattered remains of glass, the shards slicing into my palms. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the sheer, overwhelming horror of what loomed before me. The air grew thick. The scent of sugar was rotting now, sickly sweet decay filling my lungs, suffocating me. The factory lights flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the thing in front of me seem like it was everywhere at once. And then it moved, not with footsteps, not with any motion I could understand. One moment, it was standing at the center of the bottling room. The next, it was behind me. I felt it before I saw it. The syrup clung to my skin, creeping up my arms, my legs, tightening around my throat. I struggled, but it was like being caught in tar, thick, heavy, inescapable. Then, the whispering started, not from the intercom, not from the factory, from inside me. The voices burrowed deep into my skull, overlapping dozens, hundreds, whispering at once. Some begged, some laughed, some screamed, "Join us!" I fought harder, thrashing against the syrup, my body sinking, the floor pulling me in as if the entire factory had turned into a living, breathing maw. My vision blurred, my limbs going numb, the blackness swallowing my skin, my chest, my face. Then, the alarm blared. A piercing metallic wail ripped through the factory, and just like that, the syrup jerked away. The voices screamed, their whispers turning to agony as the writhing mass recoiled, shrinking back into the shadows. The factory groaned, as if the entire building was in pain. The lights flickered violently, the machines shut down, the conveyor belt stopped, and in front of me, a door, an exit. I didn't hesitate. My legs barely worked, my body was soaked in the sickening residue of whatever that thing was, but I ran. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward the doorway, my hands slamming against the metal, my fingers clawing at the handle. It wouldn't open. Please. My own voice sounded wrong, cracked and raw, barely more than a whisper against the blaring siren. Then behind me, the syrup lunged. I threw myself forward. The door gave way, and I fell. Not into the factory corridor, not into the world I knew, but onto the pavement outside. The night air was cold, biting against my syrup-drenched skin. The sky was the same dark stretch of nothingness I remembered from before my shift. But the factory was silent. No alarms, no lights, just the looming, unmarked building standing against the empty lot, as if nothing had ever happened inside. I turned back, chest heaving. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it would tear through my ribs. My arms and legs burned, but I was outside. I was alive. The factory door was still open behind me, revealing only pitch-black darkness beyond the threshold. And then, in that stillness, a single quiet sound. A soft drip. A single droplet of black syrup fell from the doorway, splattering onto the pavement, then another, and another. And then, the door slammed shut. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat, my pulse still racing. The factory was still. The world around me was empty. Then my phone buzzed. I hesitated. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket, pulling it out with numb fingers. The screen was cracked, smeared with syrup, but I could still read the notification. A new message. From my manager. 2 words. You're late.